To my melanated family and spiritually conscious brothers and sisters around the world. I am Brother Tommy. And it is time to get it in. One love, family. This video discusses how Black Americans got the Americas. We have been told that we got here on slave ships. Let's get into it. Diaspora into the ancient Americas. The Else Ages of the Pleistocene epoch, which dawned 1.6 million years ago and ended only around 10,000 BCE, sucked up seas and flooded valleys for millennia while bands of modern humans migrated and developed. We have bones from Siberia over 30,000 years old, the same in Japan, and from seafaring Papua New Guinea, even earlier, perhaps 40,000 years. The great glaciers came in waves and on several occasions for many centuries nearly dried up the oceans of the north and revealed the continent of Beringia that connected eastern Siberia, Alaska and the Yukon in North America. We have relics from Maorich in Siberia from 18,000 years ago and Bluefish Caves in Alaska from 13,000 years ago. This is because some 18,000 years ago Beringia was again a great passageway into the Americas. This was during the late Wisconsin glaciation of 18,000 years ago when great ice sheets covered large parts of North America, the so-called Laurentide and Corduroy glaciers. Most of this is no longer controversial. Yet recent evidence points to an even earlier crossing by this traveling species, and her face and lineage still bore the unmistakable stamp of an African. The earliest Americans came out of Asia and were Asians, but the first Asians were black. Indeed, as we have mentioned several times in reference to racial diversification within Homo sapiens sapiens species, this did not occur until some 25,000 years ago. Prior to 25,000 to 30,000 years ago, all Homo sapiens sapiens were black and Africoid. The first Americans appear now to have entered North America around 36,000 years ago. In other words, the very first diaspora into the Americas was black. Continuing the early work of the American Harold Sterling Gladwin in his book Man Out of Asia, Runako Rashidi and others outline that there was not one, but at least four separate waves of movement into the Americas from Asia. The first to arrive were the Australoids approximately 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. They must have brought with them the seeds of the Dreamtime religion and worldview, a paradigm of dream consciousness as a real state. That dreaming is an entry into an objective condition where contact with ancestors with forces of animate nature, and where wider bio-spiritual interactions with the environment are dynamic and possible. Survival technologies emerged from this, such as the so-called dream travel and effective medicinal remedies of a practical kind. Fanciful writers have capitalized on this for literary purposes, but the core reality is true. This intuitive embrace, this dreaming physiognomic apprehension of the world process has implicit within it curves and vectors in spacetime that keep alive a tradition of humankind chat one day may yet revolutionize the collective thrust of human consciousness. By following herds of animals, especially great bison, horses, and woolly mammoths, these Australoids appear to have traveled up from Australia into Siberia, over the Bering Strait and Beringia steppe tundra of grass and herb-rich vegetation, down the coastal regions, perhaps all the way down to the tip of South America. Again, this took thousands of years, but their remains have been found in Tierra del Fuego. The remains are those of small, Africoid peoples. The Bering Strait was available for travel by foot and watercraft during at least four separate extended periods. They appear to be the first migration of Homo sapiens sapiens, but certainly not the last. They moved into Central and South America during the Great Mid-Wisconsin Glacial period of 40,000 years ago in a slow and gradual way along the coastal ranges. Even during the Great Late Wisconsin Corduroy glaciation, the ice sheets were mostly confined to the mountains and foothill valleys, which would have passages open periodically through the upland and alpine areas along the eastern side of the Continental Divide. Also, the milder weathered coastal areas, rich with fish, bird eggs, and other seafood and shellfish, would have been open to navigation by watercraft and mixed-age population groups. Below glacial ice sheet, perhaps between 55 to 60 degrees north latitude, they spread eastward and farther south. One of their skulls, the so-called Punan skull, was found in 1923 high in the Andes and is dated between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. There are crude flake tools at Picamache, Peru, from 22,000 years ago and sophisticated obsidian blades from Tlapacoya, Mexico, from 24,000 years ago. While the ages dried up the northern seas and opened a land bridge across Siberia, they may also have dropped the southern oceans enough for this traveling race to cross it in small boats. During the late Wisconsin glaciation, the sea level fell nearly 300 feet. There is little reason to believe that peoples, over the millennia, after traveling in boats from the continent of Australia and large islands of the South Pacific, would stop here. Bands conceivably sailed eastward, stopping at various islands, some of which are presently submerged, until they reached South America. There are winds and sea currents that move from Australia and the South Pacific to the shores of South America, the so-called Peru Current, a veritable trans-Pacific water road, just as there are 3 currents from the coasts of Africa to South America and the Caribbean. This route to colonization is equally plausible. We must remember that we have found these peoples' rock art carvings and remnants of culture from 34,000 years ago. There are pebble tools at Monte Verde in Chile and rock paintings at Pedra Ferrada in Brazil, also from 34,000 years ago. From this view they are a branch of that unfolding dark line, expanding and elongating out of the original body of humankind, an expression of its cultural embryogenesis, creating a seemingly new organ in a site distant from where it began. On this new shore it would take root, grow, and await its new contact in a crisis that would give rise to more complexity and a new synthesis, a synthesis sometimes purchased at a high price. The next great wave, as discovered by Gladwin and elaborated by Rashidi, consisted of the so-called Asiatic Negroids. They came in larger waves and resembled the more Melanesian-looking peoples of the South Pacific. We should remember that over 1 million blacks live in Asia today. The nostrils, hair, lips, skin color, and other surface or phenotypical characteristics are Africoid in obvious appearance, and there are striking genetic and serological connections. The sickle cell hemoglobin, or HGS, is one of the most consistent indicators of the African racial type and where it has traveled. It is found in over 2/3 of Africa. The only other place that comes close to is in southern and central India, especially among the Dravidian peoples, the original authors of Indian civilization and the earliest practitioners of yoga. These people are scattered throughout southern Asia and the Pacific Islands and constitute much of the population of India, Melanesia, Australia in ancient times, Sumatra, and even early Arabia. These Asiatic Negroids, like the earlier Australoids who resembled the Australian Aborigines, had their own distinctive culture and signs. They encountered the earlier Australoids and fought, collaborated, traded, intermarried, and all the usual things humans of the same species came in even larger waves have done for eons. These Asiatic Negroids beginning perhaps 15,000 years ago and gradually absorbed the Australoid population. They established and advanced a more technological hunting culture with spear making, with which they hunted Ice Age mammoths, bison, and other animals some 12,000 years ago. Their fluted pointed spears were quite large and sharp, and hence more accurate than earlier spears. This represented a significant technological advance over the earlier wave of Australoid peoples and allowed the population to expand as their hunting skills increased in proficiency among the huge herds of bison and other animals roaming the plains and fields below the ice sheets that covered large sections of America. They have been found from British Columbia to northern Mexico to Nova Scotia, and even to the Far East in Florida. These Paleo-Indians, like the so-called Proto-Egyptians of Dravidian India, and the Habashi of the Bible and the Hammeritic of Africa, are all various vague ways to describe what to the naked eye of today would be a person of clear African descent. These people, whose major relics we have from 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, established the Clovis and Folsom Point cultures, taken from the name of the sites in New Mexico. Rashidi and the data suggest that instead of referring as Paleo-Indians, we call them the Clovis-Folsom Point blacks. It is worth mentioning that although the pre-Clovis cultural artifacts are present from 20,000 years before the Clovis were in North America, there are fewer such data in South America. When the Clovis suddenly appeared around 11,500 BCE, they were mostly in North America and highly evolved. This suggests that the early settling of the South American sites may not have come from the northern Beringia passageways but, as we suggested earlier, from a southern route, the South Sea Island route. They, too, diversified into other nations such as the Delaware, Cree, Shawnee, and Blackfoot. Their descendants, especially the Micmac, and Wabanaki. Wabanaki is generally used today too. Include the Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot peoples who later had contacts with other Africans who navigated the Atlantic Ocean in large ships too. The Americas long before Columbus. They, too, diversified into other nations such as the Delaware, Cree, Shawnee, and Blackfoot. Their descendants, especially the Micmac, and Wabanaki. Wabanaki is generally used today too. Include the Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot peoples who later had contacts with other Africans who navigated the Atlantic Ocean in large ships too. The Americas long before Columbus. The last wave of Asiatic peoples to move into the Americas were not Africoid at all, but Mongol. These were the Inuit. This began perhaps around 2000 BCE and seems to have occurred over 4 separate migrations. They also came in large, steady numbers for a long time and absorbed much of the earlier diminishing Australoid and Asiatic Negroid population and intermingled with the larger Algonquin population. The earlier blacks were absorbed and faded away into myths and legends of the early founders of the nations. This seems to have also occurred with the blacks of early Europe. The Vikings report little blacks living in northern Europe as late as 1000 CE, in small groups near the sea. The European unconscious is full of tales of elves, leprechauns, and little people who are dark in color and associated with mysterious rites. Yet we know that they truly existed before they were supplanted and absorbed by later groups in the cultural embryogenesis of the human organism unfolding across the globe. We have human artifacts from Brazil from 34,000 years ago and from New Mexico from 36,000 years ago that suggest this scenario. As we shall see with the rise of civilization itself, these ancient peoples, including the Algonquin, were again to meet and flourish with African peoples who came in ships from the east long before Columbus and the Europeans arrived. Genetic and blood antigen differences tend to support this multi-wave view of the peopling of ancient America. The 3 primary groups, classified by language family, are also genetically different. The Paleo-Indian group, which predominates in most of North and South America, is of primarily type O blood. The Nadian group, which is centered in Canada, Alaska, and the Southwest United States, has type O primarily, but also a healthy admixture of type A blood. However, in the Inuit groups of Canada and Alaska, we find types A, B, AB, and O blood groups, which reflects that of the rest of Earth. This suggests a series of waves of migration genetically and in language groups. We will return to this later when we look more closely at language, genetics, and the search for the mother tongue. This is one theory. What is yours? Thanks for tuning into the Melanated Roots channel. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until the next video. Peace.